Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, Mike Madaio, author of Lost Mount Penn.
We're joined by Mike Madaio. He is the author of the book Lost Mount Penn, Wineries, Railroads, and Resorts of Reading. Mike, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Now, at the beginning of the book, you have a photo of a group of men who are sitting around a table in Reading, and they've got wine glasses and wine bottles. And you say in the book that this was what spurred you to initially do your research. What did you see in that photo? What was it that intrigued you?
Yeah, so I was reading another book about the kind of history of Pennsylvania Dutch cuisine, and this photo popped up, and I'm a wine writer and also wine lover, and so I saw these guys kind of sitting around a table drinking wine, and I started, I read the caption, and it said, and I don't have it right in front of me exactly what it said, but it was something about Pennsylvania men sitting around a local wine house in the 1800s. And I thought, wow, that's something I've never heard of. And I've heard of that in Europe, but I never heard of it here. And so I just started reading, and then it started talking about these wine houses and the amazing cuisine and local wines that they served during this period. And I just thought, wow, and that's, 45 minutes from where I live, this existed, and obviously doesn't exist today. So I just sort of went down that rabbit hole, started looking up things that were mentioned in this book, and hours later I was sitting in a dark room looking at my computer screen, learning as much as I could about these wine houses at the time.
So when you started doing your research, was it difficult to find material on this time period?
Not too bad. I mean, I think the big thing for me was newspapers.com, which is a website that's affiliated with Ancestry that has lots of newspapers from the time. And so I feel like without that, it would have been a lot harder. It wouldn't have been impossible, but you were talking about microfilms and things of that nature. It would have taken me a lot longer to find some of the things that I found. So that was a huge help. I also found a lot in the library at the Berks History Center. Is a great place for lots of different pieces from the time.
Now, I think it's intriguing that the newspapers at the time were reporting on wine in that era. Was that something that surprised you?
I think that, I don't know if it surprised me, but the way people spoke about it was one of the things that really drove me into it further. I found out that this place existed, and these wine houses and these winemakers existed at the time. But beyond that, that was interesting. But then when I started reading about it, it was the way, the almost hyperbole that they used when they were talking about this, and how grand they made the times that they were having sound during this period, that really drew me in and kept me going as I was doing more research.
So we don't usually think of Reading as kind of a wine-centric area. How did grape growing and winemaking begin there?
Yeah, so the area was settled in the 1700s. It was mostly German immigrants, mostly coming from southern Germany, south central, west Germany. And we think of Germany as a beer country, but southern Germany has a strong winemaking culture as well. So these guys came over, settled in this area in Berks County, and started growing grapes, probably for their own, just to make wine for themselves and their families at first. But they started to develop a little bit of a reputation in Reading for, having quality wines in a time where a lot of people in different areas all up and down the East Coast were trying to figure out how to make wine work in the New World. And so sort of started out from there and grew. The other thing that's really important about Reading in particular is that the city is right on the Schuylkill River in Berks County, but there's several mountains just outside the city. And so some of the more knowledgeable farmers about wine growing started trying to put grapes out on the mountainsides, which is something that in Europe, if you know wine, you'll know that this kind of the best grapes grow on hillsides and mountainsides for winemaking. Areas that are maybe not so fertile for other types of farming work really well for wine. So this particular spot worked well.
Now, you mentioned that the European countries treat alcohol differently than the U.S., and that this influenced, with the immigrants coming over to Reading, that influenced their winemaking and wine drinking culture. What is that difference?
Yeah, so I mean that's kind of one of the other things that when we talked about a minute ago, when I was initially drawn into it with this winehouse culture, was that it's something that doesn't exist as much here in the United States as it obviously did back then. I think that wine is not so much, and beer, depending on where you are, it's not so much an inebriant that people drink to get drunk. It's just part of the daily life. It's what they drink with meals and with food, and that's just again just part of life, and it's not sort of something that people look down upon. Whereas in the United States, there's a lot more restrictions. Even for festivals and things of that nature. But just that culture really permutates through everything, and yeah.
So what kind of grapes were they using?
So the challenge that they faced when they came over here was, of course, there were lots of wild local grapes in the United States when European settlers came to this area. They did not make particularly good wine, however, they found out relatively quickly. So the Europeans started trying to bring vines over from Europe, but because of a variety of factors, climate, different soils, different pests, diseases, all that kind of stuff, they had a lot of trouble at the beginning. Actually, this takes us outside of Berks County and Reading, but the very first hybrid grape, so a hybrid being a cross between grapes of two different species, so the European grape and the native grape, was discovered outside of Philadelphia. So what had happened actually was that William Penn, in the 1700s, probably even late 1600s, started bringing over some vines from the Bordeaux region in France, trying to plant them. I'm sure he wasn't doing the planting himself, but his gardeners planted them. And the attempt was to, successfully grow grapes for making wine in the United States. It failed. All the grapes died after several years, and he wasn't able to successfully make any wine. But a few years later, a gardener for one of his sons discovered this grape that they called the Alexander. The guy's name was Alexander, who discovered it. And that became the very first hybrid grape. So it had kind of the hardiness of the local native grapes so that it could grow. But because it was crossed with, they don't know which, but one of the grapes that Penn had brought over, it had some of the qualities of the European grape. And so it made a palatable wine that could be drunk. It probably wasn't, as great as even the hybrids we have now, but that kind of jump started the industry for the East Coast of the United States. And then once they figured out that these hybrids could work and exist, others got developed. So as I said, Alexander was the starting point, and that's actually the starting point for wine in Reading. They had a wine called the Reading Red in kind of the early to mid 1800s that was made from Alexander, also called the Schuylkill grape. It was found on the banks of the Schuylkill. But then after that, other grapes, Catawba, which is another hybrid that's actually still available today in some East Coast regions. Isabella was another popular one. Concord, of course, was one that came out of this group as well. And actually, going up to Erie, the Welch family, who's made the Concord grape a household name, actually started out in winemaking as well. And it was really when Prohibition came along that they moved away from that. So,
now you mentioned that some of these grapes have a foxy taste to them. What does that mean? What kind of a taste is that?
yeah, it's sort of this geeky term that we use in the wine industry. But Um, it's funky is another, just a good way to describe it. It's sort of almost feral and in not such a great way. It's just a bit off-putting. Wine geeks like myself sometimes talk about weird tasting things that we have, like tar and dirt and things like that, as if they're positive. But in this case, it's almost certainly something that's not particularly favorable.
Now you talk about how it was after the Civil War that this kind of winehouse period begins. What was happening then that spurred the emergence of this cultural moment?
Sure. I mean, it's really interesting because Reading, as a town or as a city, was growing because of railroads. You had the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, which was one of the biggest companies in the world during this period. There was a lot of industry there. It was a hub. So there was a lot of things happening that made Reading a place to be. In the book, I really focus on, however, the sort of how the winemaking led into more of hospitality, saloons and wine houses and bars and things like that, which led to them becoming resorts, which led to them building, things around this idea of resorts. And it's really interesting to think of it from that standpoint. I mean, yes, there were a lot of different factors going on, but I think the fact that these early guys had really persisted and figured out how to make winemaking work here and were having success with it and continuing to grow it was part of what made the industry take off.
Now, there are a lot of interesting figures that you mentioned in your book that were involved in this industry. Jacob Lewis Kuechler is one of them, often called the hermit of Mount Penn. And who was he? How did he get started in this business?
Yeah, I mean, he's the classic character. He's the guy who really brought me into this. Again, going back to the first thing you asked me about, how I got into it. I started reading about this guy Kuechler, and he just was such a fascinating character in the way people talked about him. He essentially he came over from Germany in the 1850s, and he was a carpenter, woodmaker, various jobs like that. As he started to get a little older, he started to look for something else, and he ended up running a saloon in town, started taking interest in local wine. But this guy, just when you read about him, he was such a character, such a beloved character by the people who lived in the town. Now, he was described as like a quiet, studious sort of fellow, okay, maybe what you might call an introvert today, but he had this way of really connecting and forming these deep bonds with people. And so his saloon that he opened in town kind of quickly became this gathering place for influential, politicians and lawyers and doctors and all sorts of people like that. And then a little bit later, Kuechler decided that he wanted to move up to Mount Penn and live up there. He actually started by just renting some property, leasing some property, and creating like a little summertime hangout for him and his friends. And after a few years, decided he was going to move up there full time, got a larger place of property, built himself a little house, and ended up living up there. And again, this is before you had any trains or roads going up Mount Penn. So really the only way to get up there was to walk. It's not, it's probably 3 to 4 miles outside of town. So it's not so far away that you're completely disengaged from society, but far enough that you certainly had to make the effort. And that's kind of how he got the name, the Hermit of Mount Penn. He lived the last several decades of his life up on the mountain, started making wine, and we can talk about how his friends, were going to came up to visit him as well. But I wanted to sort of let you get a word in there. Yeah.
I guess they had a name for themselves, the Fußgängers. What does that mean, and who were they?
Yeah, so Fußgänger is the German word. It actually means pedestrian in modern German. Really, footgoers is what it literally means. And so they were mostly patrons from his bar. Again, these sort of influential people included a guy named Tom Zimmerman, who was the editor of the Reading Times, a guy named Daniel Ermentrout, who was eventually a U.S. congressman for the region. So, a lot of guys like that. And when Kuechler moved up there, they missed his bar, and so they started walking and hiking up to visit him. The joke of the day was that, you know, it was a walkers club, it was a hiking club, but every path led to the Roost. So it was essentially a bunch of guys who got together and walked up to visit their friend and drank his wine and smoked cigars and ate whatever food he prepared for them and all that kind of stuff.
Now you say that you know, that in addition to smoking cigars and drinking wine, that they were very literary.
Yeah,
There's a lot of
for sure.
poetry, and your book includes a lot of poems. Talk about that literary side of that group.
Yeah, and it sort of goes back to what I was saying before, in that the way they talked about it is what made it so compelling for me. You know, essentially a bunch of guys getting together and drinking and hanging out and having fun and making jokes. I mean, that sounds like it would have been fun to be a part of, but why are we talking about it over 100 years later? And I think it was because of the way they wrote about it. Again, they were well-educated, you know, literary people, and all in, you know, high-end jobs. And so, so they had that capacity. It was something they were interested in as well. So they used to talk about, you know, literary things and poems and things like that. But then Kuechler himself had a logbook that he kept. And so anyone who came up to visit him could write in the logbook. And as I mentioned, Tom Zimmerman, the editor of the Reading Times, was one of his best friends. Actually, the guy who came up with the name Kuechler's Roost, which was what Kuechler's place came to be known. And Zimmerman started publishing some of the things from the logbook. And so the logbook, unfortunately, is no longer with us, but by looking through some of the newspapers of the time, we can find some of the things that were written in there. And they tended to be either like a poem about, you know, visiting Kuechler's Roost, or some sort of prose that talked about it. And sometimes it was lighthearted, sometimes it was more serious, but there was a lot of really interesting stuff.
Now, over time, the mountain would become populated with a variety of sites there, vineyards and hotels and resorts. And what was it that drove the development of this hill?
Yeah, so I think that as it started, there was a number of people who had vineyards on the mountain, including Kuechler and a guy named Reiniger, and that was really the first development out there. But then in 1890, they built the Mount Penn Gravity Railroad. Now, there had been talk for quite a while of putting some sort of recreational elements on Mount Penn, and also Neversink as well, which is the mountain next door. Over in the Lehigh Valley, they had the Mauch Chunk Switchback Railway. Hope I pronounced that right. And you know, sort of that came, I don't know exactly when that was built, but kind of in the mid 1800s, that became this popular. It was originally built as a functional railway to carry supplies and things, but they turned it into like a pleasure ride. And so people would go there, and some people say that it's essentially was the first roller coaster. So this idea of a railroad for pleasure had sort of come up in this area, and that's eventually what they decided to do on Mount Penn. And it was called a gravity railroad. So it used steam originally and later electricity to go up, and then it used gravity to come down. So in a way, it was a fun ride. You got to see a lot of cool sights, and also you know, get away from the sort of the hot city in the, you know, in the warmer weather.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the food that many of these wine houses and resorts would serve. Many of these people were immigrants from Germany. Was the food influenced by where they came from?
For sure, yeah. There was a lot of German influence when you read through the menus. A lot of sausages and things of that nature. A couple of the really popular recipes of the time: chicken and waffles in the Dutch sort of Burke style, Pennsylvania Dutch Burke style. So also in Lancaster type area. But this is where you have a waffle and then you have chicken with gravy on top of it. So not the sort of fried chicken and waffle soul food that is popular nowadays, but the original. I was going to say that the chicken and waffles of Pennsylvania is actually several hundred years older than the more popular chicken and waffles today. In fact, they use waffles sort of as bread, like how we might serve bread at a meal, they would serve waffles kind of alongside a meal. So with lots of different things.
You mentioned you quote a customer of the Steigerwald uh, resort area, uh, talking about, and you quote him as saying that their chicken and waffle dinner was a culinary poem with many accompaniments in blank verse. Now,
Yeah.
that seems a bit much for a chicken and waffle dinner.
Well, I mean, first of all, that's a great example, just very short of what I was talking about, sort of the way they talked about the times that they were having. But yeah, absolutely. And then there's also there's a number of descriptions of Kuechler's roast pig, and in the book that also makes you really wish you could go back in time and try it.
Now today, Mount Penn has the pagoda, which is very famous. But before that, it had a tower. They built a tower up there. What would that have looked like if we had seen it back in its heyday?
Yeah, so it's actually on the cover of the book, which I assume you guys can show. Um, but yeah, it was just a several-story tower that was built out of stone with some wood, and there was a large dance pavilion kind of coming out of the base, and it was built as sort of the entertainment hub of this gravity railroad. So, as we said, you could ride it up to the top, and then you could get out and go to the tower, and you could get food and drink, and you could dance and hang out, and you could climb up to the top. It was 3 or 4 stories, and you could kind of look out over the mountains. And my understanding is that it certainly, if anyone knows Reading and the pagoda and how the pagoda has become kind of a symbol of the city, the tower really was that before, and that everyone who kind of came to the area wanted to visit the tower, and because you could see it from the city. It was all lit up at night and everything.
Now, the key figure that we talked about earlier, Kuechler, and he would eventually pass away in the early 1900s. What happened to his wine house?
Yeah, so well, it's interesting because to go back just a little bit, when the railroad opened in 1890, one of the laments in the newspapers, everyone talked, the people who wrote about it said it was amazing. It was this great thing that everyone needed to go see. But one of the actual laments was that it was going to kind of take away from the sort of wild, rustic nature of Kuechler's original place. And he did embrace, again, even though we call him the hermit, he did embrace the traffic from the railroad. He got a liquor license and he sold food and wine. But I think his place still remained very, centric to his friends and that sort of thing. So yeah, he died in the early 1900s. I forget what the exact date is, 1903, 1904. And after a short period, his place was taken over by another guy named Carl Scheich. It's a really tough one to say. I hope I said it right. I met his great-great-granddaughter, I think, at an event, and she told me I was saying it wrong. So I think I pronounced it right this time, Scheich. But he and his wife took over Kuechler's Roost. And despite Jacob Kuechler's plans to sort of continue to expand, the place he was living was pretty much a very rustic, just little shack. It had walls and a roof, but it didn't have much. And so Scheich and his wife really figured that they needed to make something better, and so they built this sort of Swiss style inn, and really made up the place nice, and it became even more popular and really the iconic resort of the mountain. Again, continuing the name Kuechler's Roost, but obviously under a new guise.
Now, as you mentioned at the beginning, a lot of this history has been forgotten, it's been lost. So eventually there was a decline, and the wine house culture and the growing of wine the growing of grapes in that area declined. What happened?
Yeah, I mean, it's the easiest way to say it is that Prohibition happened. But I think it is a little more complicated than that. But from a Prohibition standpoint, the big thing with that is obviously that you can no longer sell grapes. There is some evidence that some of these mountain houses may have remained open, subversively during Prohibition. Certainly in Reading proper, there were many, many bars that remained open during Prohibition, but it made it so that growing grapes to make money as a way of sustenance to support your family was really no longer a viable thing to do during Prohibition. So the grapes, I'm sure people still grew some grapes for their own personal use, but essentially they were ripped out, for other crops and things of that nature. And then when Prohibition was repealed, Pennsylvania made it incredibly difficult for wineries to exist. So the PLCB, Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board, was created just after Prohibition, really with the explicit desire to make it as hard as possible for people to get alcohol. And we joke about the PLCB today and how, this sort of public ownership of our liquor stores is somewhat strange, but at least today, they sort of have embraced customer service and things like that. Whereas back then, it was really you essentially couldn't have a winery until the 1960s, when something called the Limited Winery Act was passed, and that really allowed wineries to reopen. So Prohibition was probably the biggest thing. I think the other thing that's really important to think about is just that the car kind of took over for the train, and so there wasn't as much interest in sort of the pleasure railroad. Certainly, Reading was a city that was built on the train, being really the center of everything. Ironically, the guy who figured out how to get cars to go up hills tested his cars on Mount Penn. But yeah, so I think that was a key factor as well on sort of the economy of Reading in general, and then this area sort of going away.
So are there any examples of this late 19th century wine surviving? Wine is famous for people saving bottles in cellars. Did anybody save any?
Not that I've seen. I've seen a couple photos of bottles, but not that I'm aware of. I can't imagine, if you got there might be some Bordeaux wines that you could get that are 100 years old that might be okay to drink. It might be interesting to try. I can't imagine that anything they made back then would be all that good to try now. It's unfortunate because it would be really interesting to better understand what it tasted like. But even if it was 120 years old, that might not give you that much insight into it anyway, because it would have changed so much by then and probably vinegar.
Well, we are out of time. We've been speaking with Mike Madaio. He is the author of the book Lost Mount Penn. And Mike, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.